June 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy. A British tank commander peers through his periscope at the massive shape emerging from the morning mist. A German Panther tank, arguably the finest armoured fighting vehicle in the world. Its sloped frontal armour can shrug off almost anything the Allies can throw at it. Its 75mm gun can penetrate British tanks from distances where they cannot effectively fight back. On paper, this is an unwinnable engagement. But within minutes, this technological marvel, this masterpiece of German engineering, will become little more than a metal coffin for its crew. Not because of superior British firepower, not because of tactical brilliance, but because of a mistake so utterly ridiculous, so bureaucratically absurd, that it sounds like something from a comedy sketch rather than the largest military operation in history. The mistake: British quartermaster officers, in their infinite wisdom, had ordered thousands of smoke shells for the wrong caliber of gun. Rather than let them go to waste, someone decided they should be issued to tank crews anyway. What happened next was one of those accidents of war that changes everything. A blunder that inadvertently created one of the most effective anti-tank tactics of the entire Normandy campaign. This is the story of how British incompetence accidentally defeated German excellence, and why sometimes the most devastating weapons are the ones nobody planned to use. The challenge facing British tank commanders in Normandy was stark and immediate. The German Panther tank represented a quantum leap in armoured warfare. Introduced in 1943 following lessons learned on the Eastern Front, the Panther combined mobility, protection and firepower in ways that existing Allied tanks simply could not match. Its frontal armour, sloped at clever angles, was 80mm thick, effectively the equivalent of 140mm against incoming rounds. A British Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch it from the front. The Panther's own gun, by contrast, could punch through a Sherman from over a kilometre away. The statistics tell a sobering story. In head-to-head engagements, Panthers destroyed Allied tanks at a ratio that sometimes reached 5-to-1 or higher. British tank crews dubbed them Panthers, with a mixture of respect and dread. The Churchill, Britain's primary infantry tank, was better armoured than the Sherman, but still outgunned. The Cromwell was faster, but more lightly protected. The Firefly, a Sherman fitted with the excellent 17-pounder gun, could destroy a Panther. But there were never enough Fireflies to go around, typically just one per troop of 4 tanks. The tactical problem was maddening. British tanks needed to get close to have any chance of penetrating a Panther's side, or rear armour, where the plating was thinner. But closing the distance against an enemy that could kill you from well beyond your effective range was suicidal. The Panther's optics were superb, its crews well trained. It could engage accurately at ranges where British tanks were still trying to identify whether they were looking at friend or foe through the characteristic Normandy haze. Something had to give, or the armoured advance through France would become unacceptably costly. The solution arrived not through brilliant tactical thinking or technological innovation, but through sheer bureaucratic bungling. Somewhere in the British supply system, someone had ordered tens of thousands of smoke shells designed for 25-pounder field guns. These were indirect fire artillery pieces, not tank weapons. How exactly this order went wrong remains unclear. The records are, unsurprisingly, vague on the details of administrative cock-ups. What is clear is that by May 1944, British supply depots in southern England were absolutely drowning in 25-pounder smoke shells that nobody needed. The 25-pounder used ammunition that was physically incompatible with tank guns. You couldn't simply load one into a Sherman and fire it. But someone, And again, records don't specify who deserves credit or blame. Notice that these smoke shells contained a particular type of white phosphorus mixture. White phosphorus, or willy peat in military slang, was primarily valued for creating smoke screens. When the shell burst, the phosphorus ignited on contact with air, creating dense white clouds that could obscure vision for several minutes. What made this particular batch interesting was the concentration. These weren't designed for the relatively gentle dispersal of artillery fire from several kilometers away. They were overpowered, designed to create immediate, thick smoke for field guns, laying down covering fire. And white phosphorus had another property that made it particularly nasty. It burned at approximately 815 degrees Celsius, stuck to anything it touched, and was nearly impossible to extinguish. Water wouldn't put it out. In fact, water made it worse, as the phosphorus would reignite once it dried. Some enterprising ordnance officer, possibly trying to clear warehouse space, decided that tank crews should receive these smoke shells. Not to fire from their main guns, obviously, but there was a solution. The 2-inch mortar. Most British tanks carried a small, hull-mounted 2-inch mortar for laying smoke screens to cover movement or retreat. The mortar used its own specific ammunition, but in a pinch, with some modification, those 25-pounder smoke shells could be broken down and their contents repackaged into improvised 2-inch mortar rounds. It was crude. It probably violated several ordnance regulations, but it worked after a fashion. Tank crews in England preparing for D-Day suddenly found themselves with an absolute abundance of smoke rounds for their hull mortars. Where they might normally carry 10 or 15, they now had access to dozens. The official guidance was simple. Use them to create smoke screens, obscure enemy vision, cover your movements, standard tactical doctrine. No one, however, had really thought through what would happen when you saturated an enclosed armored vehicle with white phosphorus smoke. The first reports came in from the bocage country south of Caen. The bocage, the ancient Norman hedgerows, was a nightmare for armored warfare. Fields were small, visibility limited, and every hedgerow could hide an anti-tank gun or a Panther in ambush. British tank units were taking casualties, but something odd was happening. Crews reported firing their smoke mortars at Panthers during engagements. Standard doctrine: create a screen, break contact, or maneuver for a better position. But crews were noticing that after saturating an area with smoke, Panthers would sometimes simply stop. Engines still running, but no movement, no return fire. After the smoke cleared, ground troops moving up would find the tanks abandoned, hatches open, crews gone or dead nearby. The realization came gradually. White phosphorus smoke wasn't just obscuring vision, it was getting into the tanks. The Panther, for all its excellence, had a weakness that German engineers had never quite solved: ventilation. The tank needed air for the crew and engine. It drew air in through various ports and vents. Normally, this worked fine. But when surrounded by dense white phosphorus smoke, those same ventilation systems became death traps. The smoke was pulled into the crew compartment. White phosphorus smoke isn't just opaque. It's toxic. It causes severe respiratory irritation, chemical burns to the eyes and lungs, and insufficient concentration can be lethal. Inside a closed metal box, with nowhere for the smoke to disperse, the effects were catastrophic. Crew members would be simultaneously blinded, choking, and experiencing the sensation of their lungs burning. Panic would set in within seconds. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The German crew's options were all terrible. Stay buttoned up and suffer potentially fatal exposure to the smoke, or open the hatches and bail out, making themselves vulnerable to machine gun fire from the British tanks that had just fired the smoke rounds. Panther crews were trained to stay buttoned up under most circumstances, but no amount of training prepares you for the feeling that you're suffocating and burning simultaneously inside your own tank. What made this tactic particularly effective was its psychological impact. German tank commanders couldn't predict when it would happen. Unlike high-explosive rounds or armor-piercing shot, which you might see coming or hear impacting, smoke rounds gave no warning. One moment you're in a functioning, protected fighting vehicle. The next, you're blind, choking, and desperate. The fear factor became significant. Panther crews operating in areas where British tanks were known to use this tactic became notably more cautious, sometimes refusing to take optimal positions because they feared being smoked out. British crews, meanwhile, developed increasingly sophisticated techniques. They learned that wind direction mattered enormously. Firing smoke rounds upwind of a Panther position and letting the breeze carry the cloud over the target was more effective than direct hits. They learned that sustained fire, 3, 4, 5 smoke rounds in rapid succession, created concentrations that were almost impossible to endure. They learned to coordinate with infantry, who would be ready to engage any crew members who bailed out. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their own smoke rounds were designed for different purposes and didn't create the same toxic, clinging clouds. German tank crews had smoke dischargers, small launchers that could fire smoke grenades to create concealment, but these produced relatively clean smoke that dissipated quickly. The Wehrmacht had substantial chemical warfare capability, but Hitler had expressly forbidden its use after World War I experiences. And in any case, German chemical weapons were artillery delivered, not tactical systems that tank crews could employ. American tank units experimented with similar tactics, but found them less effective. The US Army had its own white phosphorus rounds, designated M15, but they were designed for anti-personnel use, clearing bunkers and fighting positions. American doctrine didn't emphasize using them against armored vehicles in the same way. The British approach, born of desperate improvisation and an accidental surplus, remained unique. The actual historical impact is difficult to quantify precisely. Tank battles are chaotic, and after-action reports don't always distinguish between kills achieved by different methods. But British armoured units operating in Normandy between June and August 1944 reported a marked increase in Panthers abandoned or captured intact after smoke saturation attacks. Some estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 4 Panther losses in certain sectors during this period involved crews abandoning functional vehicles due to smoke-related causes. The psychological effect extended beyond immediate engagement. German tank doctrine emphasized the Panther's ability to engage at long range, using superior optics and firepower. But if closing to short range meant potential smoke attacks, that advantage diminished. British tank commanders became noticeably bolder in pressing attacks, knowing they had a weapon that could neutralize even Panthers at close quarters. The confidence factor mattered. Interestingly, the tactic's effectiveness declined after August 1944. German crews learned countermeasures. Some Panthers had additional filtration systems fitted to their ventilation. Crews trained to immediately button up completely at the first sign of smoke and switch to internal air supplies, accepting temporary blindness rather than exposure. By the time Allied armies were fighting in Germany proper, the tactic was less decisive. But during those crucial months in Normandy, when every destroyed Panther mattered, it was extraordinarily effective. The legacy is peculiar. Post-war analysis acknowledged the tactic, but didn't celebrate it, partly because it originated from a mistake, partly because using white phosphorus against tank crews occupied a grey area in terms of international law. White phosphorus isn't classified as a chemical weapon under the Geneva Protocol, but its use against personnel is controversial. The fact that it was being used to force crews from their vehicles, after which they could be engaged with conventional weapons, made some military lawyers uncomfortable. Modern tank designers learned lessons. Ventilation systems in contemporary armored vehicles include filtration and overpressure systems specifically designed to prevent external contaminants from entering the crew compartment. The NBC, Nuclear, Biological, Chemical Protection Systems, standard in tanks from the 1960s onwards, were partly inspired by these Normandy experiences. You can still see late production Panthers in museums today. At Bovington in England, at the Deutsches Panzer Museum in Munster. And if you look carefully at the ventilation grills, you can understand the vulnerability. Some of those original improvised smoke rounds, or at least the storage canisters, survive in military museums, though the white phosphorus itself was long ago safely disposed of. The Imperial War Museum has documentation of the tactic in its archives, tucked away in after-action reports that few researchers ever examine. So return to that moment in June 1944, that British tank commander facing a Panther in the Norman hedgerows. He has options now. He can try to flank, risking exposure to that devastating gun. He can call for artillery or air support, if any is available. Or he can do something the German crew isn't expecting. He can order his hull mortarmen to pump round after round of smoke into the wind, letting that dense, toxic cloud drift over the Panther's position and wait. Wait for the hatches to pop open. Wait for desperate men to emerge, gasping. Wait for the finest tank in the German arsenal to become just another metal shell, abandoned by a crew that couldn't breathe. One mistake, one ridiculous, bureaucratic mistake about the wrong type of ammunition. And the Panther, Hitler's answer to Soviet T-34s, the tank that was supposed to restore German armored superiority, became vulnerable to something as mundane as smoke. Not the clever smoke of tactical doctrine, but the toxic smoke of improvisation, of making do, of turning a cock-up into a weapon. That's the thing about war. Sometimes it's not the best technology that wins. Sometimes it's just the side that makes the most useful mistakes.